All right, hello, History 361. This is the last lecture of what is sure to be remembered as a dismal semester. So we left off talking about the 4th century and the triangulation and retriangulation of the three most powerful poleis in Greece: Sparta, Athens, and Thebes. And when we left off, basically at the end of the 350s, all of them have taken a big hit. The Spartans take the first hit when the Thebans defeat the Spartan army at the Battle of Leuctra, slaughter a substantial portion of the adult male Spartiate population, the homoioi, and then proceed into Messenia, and by 369 liberate the Messenians and establish a powerful fortified polis at Messenia. And so while the Spartans still have their kind of small crack army, they no longer are really in a position to be a great Grecian power. The Athenians, meanwhile, have suffered in the 350s from a revolt of some members of their naval confederacy, the Second Athenian Naval Confederacy. Athens also seems to be having financial problems throughout much of the 4th century that prevent them from dispatching the numbers of ships that say they've been able to during their 5th century peak. And of course, it's not surprising that Athens is having financial problems. They no longer have an empire to fund big public building projects and a navy and pay juries, and so their means are going to be much more limited. It's harder for them to project power into the Aegean. And then the Thebans have they've engaged in this brutal, dispiriting sacred war with Phocas. The Phocians have seized Delphi and have used the money from the treasury of Delphi to build a huge mercenary army, and the Thebans are just bleeding out as they engage in this long, largely kind of unsuccessful war with Phocas. The Thebans kind of win, but it's a grinding, difficult victory. Now, as all three of these powers subsequently sort of weaken themselves, a new power is rising in the north, and that's Macedonia. Now, this whole time, Macedonia has been at most a supporting character, and oftentimes a character that simply isn't even worth mentioning as we try to sort of flush out a master narrative. Macedonia had been conquered by the Persians in the 490s. It had immediately Medized again when the Persians come back in the 480. And Macedonia even gets pushed around traditionally by Athens. It's a territorial kingdom, but the kings of Macedonia have historically been weak. The Macedonian highlands are full of these barons who, in some ways, come from a tradition of they've always been kind of chiefs over their domain. Maybe, yes, they acknowledge the sort of suzerainty of the Macedonian king down in Pella, but it's a weak kingship, and the kings themselves aren't able to easily mobilize the resources of Macedonia, in part because you have all these kind of feudal barons who are happy to serve in the king's cavalry from time to time to say keep the Illyrians out or the Celts out, but are happy for the kingdom to be kind of decentralized. Now, Philip, and this is actually kind of a sign of how weak Macedonia is. For a while, Philip, as the younger son of the Macedonian king, is sent to Thebes as a hostage to make sure that the Macedonians behave themselves. This is during the period of Theban hegemony. And as a hostage in Thebes, he is there while Epaminondas is experimenting with new types of infantry tactics, where the Thebans are creating a deeper, denser hoplite phalanx that's upwards of 50 men deep. And while he doesn't specifically copy Theban infantry tactics, one thing that may strike him is the importance of having an infantry army. Something Macedonia doesn't really have. In Macedonia, the big barons ride as cavalrymen. There's some weak kind of infantry on the side, but this is one reason why Macedonia struggles to hold its own in any major war. Now, in 359, the Macedonian disasters continue. Philip at this point is back, but the king of Macedonia is killed. Amytos is killed by the Illyrians, people who have sort of tribal people who have invaded Macedonia, kill the king, wipe out his army. And at this point, the heir is a child. And the Macedonian assembly, which is basically the army kind of as a voting assembly, seems to elevate Philip, maybe first as a regent, but very quickly he assumes the kingship. And so therefore he becomes king, succeeding his brother. Philip, Macedonia is in a really bad place, but Philip manages, in dealing with this crisis, to dramatically strengthen both the Macedonian state and the Macedonian kingship. He does this in a number of ways. One, he creates a new army. And this new army is going to be based around an infantry phalanx. So he starts recruiting Macedonian peasantry into the infantry. Now, he arms this phalanx with probably a regional Macedonian pike called a sarissa. But the sarissa is much longer than the spears that Greek hoplites carry. And so that's going to make it a little different. In addition, so the Macedonian pike phalanx that Philip is kind of creating, they have these very long spears. He arrays them at a much deeper depth. Maybe he takes that at the Thebans. So the average depth of a Macedonian pike phalanx is 16 versus the average depth of 8 that we see frequently for Greek hoplite phalanxes. And so he has this increasingly well-drilled infantry formation that probably has roughly 10,000 soldiers in it. And it's possible he's also even copying the practice of Persian kings, because the Macedonian Philip does seem to look to Persia for what should a king look like. Well, Persian king has this full-time bodyguard, the immortals of 10,000 men. So Philip has this new phalanx. He's actually quite good in integrating other types of soldiers around that phalanx, both the heavy cavalry, who are the Macedonian barons, the traditional arm of the Macedonian elite, light infantry, peltasts, and he also becomes very interested in siege warfare and uses, hires some of the best Greek technicians to come in and build him some of the most modern type of siege weapon. So this is even though it's based around this pike phalanx, this is a combined arms army. Now, armies cost money. And Macedonia traditionally has not been a very wealthy state. So where does Philip get the money? Well, conquest. Not just loot, but early on he strikes and captures the gold mining regions around Amphipolis, and silver and gold mining regions. And revenues from these mining areas will be something that will undergird Philip's expansionism. And Philip expands in almost every direction he can over the next several decades. Now, some of this he does through conquest, wars against the Illyrians and the Thessalians and in the Chalcidic Peninsula. He's expanding in almost every direction. He also, engages in diplomacy to improve his position. Philip is not I'm just going to fight it out guy. He fights a lot. But as his strength rises, he also uses diplomacy and especially marriage alliances to improve his position. And here's a Macedonian king has an advantage that most other Greek statesmen don't. Macedonian kings are polygamous. They marry multiple women. And again, Greek men, while they may have their hetairai and other women on the side, are monogamous when it comes to lawful marriage. Macedonian kings can have as many wives as they want. And for Philip, this works out because he has a wife who's Thessalian and a wife who's Illyrian and a wife who's from Molossian, from Epirus, who's the mother of Alexander the Great. And that means that as if he wants to seal a treaty or a new diplomatic relationship, oftentimes it's convenient to seal that with a marriage alliance. So Philip is expanding, and this brings him frequently into conflict with Greek city-states. Firstly, with Thebes, which is in some ways Philip kind of intervenes in the sacred war intermittently, mostly not because he really wants to solve the problem of the sacred war, but Delphi is governed by an Amphictyony. It's governed by a council of cities that are around Delphi. And as Philip is fighting, particularly in Thessaly, he deliberately tries to capture cities that have votes in the Delphic and Amphictyony. And once he has those votes, this actually gives him a kind of power, right? That now he can actually control the governance of Delphi. And it also gives him prestige in the Greek world. Now, in Athens, there is significant debate about whether Philip should be sort of appeased or whether he should be challenged. The great voice for a confrontation with Philip is Demosthenes, one of the last great Athenian orators, who is constantly advocating for military confrontation with Philip. That being said, many of the Athenians are unsure, and Athens is not in a particularly strong position to counter Philip at this moment. Now, Philip's relationships with the Greek city-states have varied, but in 338, it seems that he is ready to move aggressively against them, probably with the goal of establishing a kind of new hegemony over the Greeks in the south. And so he appears outside Elatria, therefore threatening central Greece. And here, Demosthenes is critical in arranging an alliance between Thebes and Athens. Missing from this alliance are the Spartans. Now, again, the Spartans aren't as powerful now that they've lost Messenia, but they still have a field contingents of a small contingent, but a contingent of Spartans and also troops from Laconia. The Spartans refuse to help the Thebans and Athenians. And this is actually kind of the tragedy of this triangulation, is that at this point it is almost impossible to get all three cities to ally with one another. They simply cannot trust each other and are too afraid about what would happen if, what would happen if they won. So Sparta sits this one out, and this, of course, is going to put Athens and Thebes at a disadvantage. In a great battle that is fought at Chyornaya in 338, the Athenians and the Thebans and other allies are ultimately defeated by Philip II, who is aided by his young son, Alexander. Alexander leads a cavalry charge that confronts the Thebans, including the Theban sacred band. We were told that all 300 men of the Theban sacred band are killed, and indeed over 250 skeletons have been excavated from that battlefield. It seems to be the remains of the sacred band, or at least those skeletons were found buried in about the right number where supposedly the Theban sacred band was massacred. So now we have Athens and Sparta defeated. Philip is has his army. And Philip decides that the way that he's going to exert power over Greece is to create a new league of Greek city-states, the so-called League of Corinth, because it meets in Corinth. And that the league will elect, surprise, surprise, will elect Philip as its general. So this gives Philip the ability to send orders to League cities, particularly to request troops or supplies from them. So the League of Corinth is kind of the mechanism that Philip plans to use to exert his hegemony over the Greek city-states after Chyornaya. And he does have in mind a plan to try to unify, maybe in a kind of a moral sense, his new conquests. There have been calls, including from some in Athens. For example, the writer Socrates has actually, before Chyornaya, has written to Philip and saying, you know what, we still have these Greek city-states on the Ionian coast who are subject to the Achaemenid Empire. Wouldn't it be nice if the Greeks set aside their wars and liberated these cities from the Persians. This is a kind of solution to the dispiriting, stagnating warfare that we see as Athens and Sparta and Thebes and their allies triangulate and re-triangulate. So then people say, why not, instead of doing that, why don't we go fight the Persians? Philip sits on this idea, but after Chyornaya, he says, hey, that's a great idea. I'll lead them. And this will be actually a way to unite the Greeks behind my leadership and maybe have them more sort of gratefully embrace the hegemony that I've just established. So Philip is plotting this expedition, and then he is murdered in 336. Murdered after he has paraded a procession of statues of all 12 of the Olympian gods, and then behind those 12 statues is an image of Philip himself. Clearly, his own self-conception is on the rise. And then he's cut down, murdered in public. The murderers are subsequently quickly hunted down. The motive ostensibly seems to be a bodyguard that Philip has been in a sexual relationship with, but then has been subsequently wronged by Philip's new, father-in-laws. He's taken yet another wife, a daughter of a Macedonian nobleman. So this is, the situation is described for us as this kind of strange internal feud, and so kind of a personal matter. There have always been rumor, historians have speculated, and I should stress this is speculation, that the murder is arranged even by his son Alexander the Great, for fear that now that Philip is marrying a daughter of a Macedonian nobleman, that maybe he might favor the child of that marriage more than Alexander, who is the product of a marriage with a Molossian, a non-Macedonian woman. It's hard to say. While there had been some feuding between Alexander and his father, there was no reason to think that he wasn't in a very strong position to be the favored successor. It's one of those things that it's hard to say. Suffice it to say, Philip is dead by 336. Alexander is now the king of Macedonia. And this is where our story traditionally ends, with the Macedonian victory at Chyornaya. We are sort of the imperial agency of Greek city-states like Athens and Thebes and Sparta is going to be curtailed. And we're going to emerge into a new system, the so-called Hellenistic world, where all of those polis still exist. They haven't gone away. They continue to have agency, a civic life, in many instances, democracies. But they are no longer the most powerful players on the block. The most powerful players are now going to be Greek-speaking kings who will dominate the geopolitics of the Eastern Mediterranean. So if you are interested in the Hellenistic world, I strongly encourage you to take my class, History 362, HST 362, next semester, because we will, the story that we've just, under quite dismal circumstances, looked at isn't over. And so what we will be doing next semester, if you care to join us, is to take this story from Alexander's accession to the Macedonian kingship, and then look at the Hellenistic world to the arrival at Rome. And we'll actually end when the last Hellenistic dynast, Cleopatra, commits suicide in 31 BC. So we will that will be next semester. For now, we've done the best we can. I'll be putting some more information up on Blackboard about our final, and also a turn-in place where you can turn in your final paper. So we will be in touch, and hopefully I will see you all in person next semester.